Uh, Hi, I'm Mara, and this is your Trilogy, and today I will be reviewing The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebald. So if you're wondering why I am dressed in this super fashionable outfit, that is because The Lovely Bones takes place, or at least starts, in the 70s. So I decided to dress as appropriate because what's better than a sad clown but a sad hippie? Anyway, to tell you a bit of the backstory I have with this book, I actually tried to read it in high school when it first was super popular and the movie was made. However, after reading a couple chapters, I don't know if I even made it to the second chapter because I listened to it, so I'm not entirely sure the chapter breaks in this book. But after not getting really far at all, I was very close to the beginning, I found the book too depressing and just put it down. It starts off depressing, continued being depressing, and I was like, nope, not doing this, putting it away. So kudos to you, book, for making me feel, and kudos to Alice Sebald for making me feel. However, at the end of last year, I saw a video about a scene in the Lovely Bones movie, and I could not stop thinking about that book. So on a whim, I downloaded it on Overdrive, which luckily there's no wait, so I just got the book right away, and listened to it in 3 days. It would have been 2, except I was like slightly off on the 2-day mark because things came up. But yeah, I devoured this book. And The Lovely Bones does quite a lot of things I personally have not read before, and I think it does it well. So first I'm gonna read the Goodreads blurb for the book. My name was Salmon, like the fish. First name, Susie. I was 14 when I was murdered on December 6th, 1973. So begins the story of Susie Salmon, who is adjusting to her new home in heaven, a place that is not at all what she expected. Even as she is watching life on Earth continue without her, her friends trading rumors about her disappearance, her killer trying to cover his tracks, her grief-stricken family unraveling. Out of unspeakable tragedy and loss, The Lovely Bones succeeds miraculously in building a tale filled with hope, humor, suspense, and even joy. So yeah, I think that blurb for this book is pretty accurate. So this video will include some spoilers for the story, especially in my first point. I will go into Susie's entire character arc. However, I don't think that these take away from the story. I knew most of the spoilers. However, I won't be telling scene level family stories as much as just Susie's general arc and where she ends up with at the end. But it's really not a spoiler because you know that's where the book's going from the beginning. That's the point of Susie's arc. And one thing I'd like to note is this book does a lot of things I have never read before, and I think it pulls them off well. Again, I haven't read these before, so I can't compare and contrast, but I really was excited to see some more experiments with writing, or just things in writing I haven't read much of, because as a writer, I would like to read them so I can learn how to do them if I choose to, or I see examples of how to do these things. So I want to get right into the main points of this review. So let's start with number 1, the unique perspective. So one thing you might have been able to guess based on the blurb is this book is actually written in first-person omniscient point of view, which I have never read before. It is written from Susie's perspective in heaven, but she has privy to all of the characters' thoughts and memories. So though this is through Susie's eyes, we get to know every character's thoughts and memories because she knows every character's thoughts and memories, which is such a unique perspective, and I think this book pulls it off fairly well. I would say sometimes it reads more third person, and I feel like it could have actually emphasized the fact it was first person more throughout the book. But even then, I haven't really read much third person omniscient, if at all, so I still learned from that. So though I really appreciated such a unique perspective from what I've normally read and feel like I've learned from it, I do have an issue with how it was done. The audiobook I listened to had an introduction from the author, and in fact the audiobook I listened to, the whole thing was read by the author, which she did a very good job. But I digress. Alice Sebold says how she wrote this book as a way to tell the story of those who have tragically died in attacks like Susie experiences at the beginning of this book. However, throughout the whole book, Susie is an extremely unbiased narrator. She immediately accepts her death and never really judges anyone on Earth, not even her killer. She does fear for people like family members when they're in danger, but she doesn't judge. And personally, I wish this book had given her a stronger voice and allowed her to have a character arc, because to me, she is a stagnant character. I wish Susie had experienced denial and grief about her death, anger towards her killer, resentment towards her mother's actions, instead of immediately understanding everyone. Especially because this book sets it up to be about her moving on from her death so that she can go to true heaven as opposed to the in-between heaven she currently is in. But since she has no obvious change throughout the book, it feels arbitrary. I honestly have no clue what changed about her that allowed her to move on. To me, it felt like the author just decided when Susie would move on based on how much of the family story she wanted to tell. And it's not that this is inherently bad, like she could have had a set amount of the family story she wanted to tell before Susie could move on so she could tell the whole story, but there isn't any key thing that happens at the end of it. So it just feels so deliberate by the author that it's like, Susie's just watching this and whoop, I'm done with this story. Let Susie move on. I wish Susie had an internal character arc throughout the story, and I think it would have been so cool if maybe Susie, as time went on, became more omniscient when she learns not to resent or judge and was able to truly experience people's thoughts, or for those thoughts to allow Susie to become less judgmental or to accept her death, seeing her family move on, because Susie needed a stronger character arc. And I think it would have been so cool to see Susie's character arc parallel with the story of her family, as opposed to it just being the author telling Susie's family story with Susie narrating it but not really impacting it at all. I think if Susie had had a stronger character arc, then her moving on to true heaven would have felt more significant, whereas it really didn't feel like a big deal, especially since after Susie moves to true heaven, she continues to be omniscient about everything going on Earth and being able to view it whenever she wants. The only difference is she says she doesn't want to view it as often, but that's so arbitrary, and it makes Susie's internal journey after her death feel kind of pointless. This is a story about a family's grief. Like, if anything, if Susie was cut out and it was just about the family from a omniscient third person perspective instead of Susie's, it wouldn't have changed that much. Susie's voice did add some to the language, and there were some things Susie said that were beautiful, but I really wish Susie felt more like a character as opposed to an interesting narrator who stays the same like a third person narrator would. And the fact that Susie continues the story after reaching true heaven makes true heaven feel not that big a deal. And I think the story would have been better if it ended right before she went there, instead of having Susie go there and then be like, here's a couple more lines of what my family's doing and a couple more paragraph pages. It felt like almost a whole chapter or half a chapter happened of her watching them for a while after. It should have ended with Susie going to true heaven. I like the final line of the book. That could stay the same, but it should have been said right as she was going to true heaven. So though I did like Susie's perspective and how it affected the writing style and how Susie was omniscient first person, don't get me wrong, I think it was well done. I think Susie being the perspective narrator did change it from what it would be third person, especially with how she was personally connected to her family and how she would refer to them as her family, her death. I do think that makes it more impactful, but I think it would have been even better if Susie had been more of a character with a character arc. I wish Susie had gone on a journey alongside her family as opposed to just being an interesting perspective. Number 2, Let's discuss the timeline of the book. This book takes place over the span of about 10 years. When I first heard that this book took place over such a long amount of time, I assumed it would be a pretty even spread. However, one thing I realized is it's not very even at all. The entire first year is told pretty consistently, but then when it gets to the anniversary of Susie's death, it just skips to the next anniversary at the end of the second year of Susie's death, and then it goes into the third year. And quite a few other years are skipped too. Multiple years are sometimes skipped in chunks too. However, it feels very natural. And if anything, writing consistently every single year would have bogged the story down. The passage of time always made sense and never confused me. And I think this book is a good balance of choosing the key important moments of characters' lives to put into the story, while also having enough downtime moments to make it feel natural. It doesn't feel like a highlight reel, but it also doesn't bog you down with boring day-to-day things. And as someone who mostly reads adventure books that take place over a short amount of time, this was a great change of pace and also a learning experience. Speaking of pace, the pacing of this book was also pretty well done. Now let's get into the third point. This is 100% a character-driven story. The thing about this book is that there isn't really a plot or goal as much as there is a journey. The book cleverly draws readers in with the tension of a more catch-the-killer plotline, but that soon fades away into a story about grief and loss and healing. And the book is able to pull off such a seemingly plot-lacking storyline by having such well-rounded and alive-feeling characters. I genuinely cared about the characters as I watched them grow. They aren't the typical boring, blank slate, insert yourself in, hashtag relatable type characters that some books have, and the characters also just don't resort to having a flashy shtick to make them stand out among the large cast of characters that many ensemble books do. These characters felt like well-rounded and real people with their own beliefs and fears, and each of them was memorable in their own way despite the large cast. And in fact, in writing characters that are true to themselves, they had aspects I find relatable, because it's not that relatability is bad, it's just when you write a character to try to be relatable to everyone, they'll be relatable to no one. But with such a large cast of characters, I'm sure at least one of them will have something that anyone can relate to. In fact, the dad in this book is my new favorite fictional dad. He is the best fictional dad I can remember reading in a long time. I also really enjoyed following Susie's sister, Lindsay. And even though while Susie's dad is dad of the year, Susie's mom is definitely not going to be mom of the year. She is still a complex, interesting character with her own storyline who feels real, and I enjoyed reading about the mom despite her not being that great of a mom. Now let's get to point number 4. The supernatural aspect of this book could have been done a lot better. I'm not the type of person to look for plot holes in supernatural aspects, and it's not even that there was plot holes, it's just that it wasn't developed really enough at all. Susie is in the in-between heaven, and we're really only told about it and we don't get shown it much. There are a couple small scenes when Susie describes heaven and people doing things in it, but it felt very distant to me, which was weird because at the beginning of the book, it set up 2 different characters in Susie's heaven who get names and there's dialogue between them, and then they're completely forgotten throughout the book, which it's like, why'd you set them up if they were going to be dropped? I feel like, especially because one of them's a young girl, Susie's age, who for all we know probably was also murdered, there could have been that sort of empathy and bonding between them. And I feel like if Susie had directly interacted with this character more, and maybe they grieved together and moved on together, and maybe even the other girl moved on before Susie and she was stuck by herself trying to figure out what to do, it would have made Susie's character arc feel stronger, and it would have made Susie feel more like a fleshed out character as opposed to an interesting narrator. But instead, Susie's friend Holly is is completely forgotten. Also, there are times where Susie directly affects life on Earth, which is cool, but they're always accidental. If the book had shown Susie actively trying to affect Earth and improving her ability to affect it throughout the entire book, or done the reverse where Susie can more easily affect it at the beginning, but it becomes harder and harder throughout the book and she's struggling with losing her connection to Earth, that would be interesting and it would make this aspect feel more connected to both Susie and the story. But instead, it's just a bunch of tiny little accidental things near the beginning of the book, and then it's completely dropped throughout the most of the book until there's one giant thing at the end of the book, which is also accidental. And I feel like if the author wanted to do something that big at the end, it should have been the storyline where Susie is actively trying to interact on Earth and cause that to happen. It just feels like the author forced it to happen because she wanted to write it happening. Which this is the big spoiler scene I'm going to talk about. So if you don't want to hear about it, I will have the timestamps in the description for when the spoiler section is over. And in the bar of the video, it should have a little spoiler section and you can just skip to the next one. So let's get into the spoiler because you cannot discuss this book without discussing this spoiler. I highly recommend that you do stick for the spoiler section, especially if you don't plan on reading the book, because this is the weirdest scene I have ever read in my life. So early on in the book, when Susie dies and goes to heaven, she accidentally touches Ruth on the way, which results in Ruth being connected to ghosts. And though Susie and Ruth weren't close in school, they sort of interacted a couple of times and they seemed like they liked each other. Growing up, Ruth is extremely affected by Susie's death and becomes close friends with the boy that Susie liked, who she actually kissed soon before dying. That's the setup. So after years of Susie being in the in-between and Ruth and Susie's crush both growing up to adults, like college-age adults, one day Susie just randomly possesses Ruth's body. And Susie uses this opportunity to have sex with her childhood sweetheart, who realizes it's Susie for some reason. And it's really weird reading about this murdered 14-year-old girl possessing a woman who is a lesbian's body to have sex with her childhood sweetheart, who is now an adult, and the other woman's also adult. It's what? It's so weird. Logistically, the scene is kind of rapey because Ruth's body is being used for sex against her, but it's also really weird because I could believe if it had been addressed that Ruth would agree to let Susie use her body to have sex, because Ruth is like in love with Susie, and I think she did things with that guy before. Like, based on Ruth's character, I could believe that Ruth would be willing to let Susie possess her to experience sex, which she never got to. I could believe Ruth would be that selfless and let Susie do that. Now, the book never actually has Susie ask about it, or Ruth or Susie talk to each other about it. Ruth just doesn't seem to care afterwards. However, ignoring that, this scene, even with the consent, would have been terrible. Because the book makes it out like having sex is what Susie needs to do to move on. Because she never got to have sex before she was raped and murdered, so it's reclaiming the act as something good for her and not something violent done to her. Which, for a living character, would be a fine storyline. But if you're trying to represent people tragically murdered in these types of attacks, it undermines the point, because Susie's dead. Realistically, people who were murdered in this way will never get to do that. They won't get to reclaim things that were done to them. They're dead. They don't get to try again. And this feels more like wish fulfillment than acceptance. Like, the author liked Susie so much, she wanted to give her this opportunity and fulfill Susie's wishes, not necessarily the author's personal self-insert type thing. But realistically, Susie should have just moved on. This feels like a case of when the author gave Susie what she wanted instead of what she needed, realistically based on Susie's circumstances. Because at the end of the day, murder victims don't get to live out things that they missed. It just doesn't happen. It's tragic and sad, But by having Susie get to live out these things when other people who in real life would not get to, it kind of just makes her not as good of a representation of their stories, which based on the author's excerpt at the beginning was what I thought the author was going for. Also, this scene was written pretty steamy with both characters doing it multiple times and describing like them touching like the hair down below, and it's TMI, and also like it's like again, it's not some innocent sweet first time type of thing, which might have been pulled off better. It would have made more sense to me at least. It's this steamy two adults doing it multiple times in like multiple locations within this one building, and every time Susie kisses the dude, she sees what Ruth is doing in heaven because Ruth is currently in heaven while Susie's in her body, and it's just so weird. Like Ruth is giving spoken word to the ghost while Susie and this dude are having an erotic session, and every time they kiss, Susie just sees Ruth, and it's like, what? This is so weird. Which the book is definitely better than the movie, but the movie just makes it an innocent kiss, which is 100 times better than what the book did with this plot point. I am not a fan of whatever the heck the author was thinking when she did this. It's like the weirdest thing I've ever read. What? It's the weirdest thing I've ever read. What? Like, if the author did want to have Susie get to have sex, it should have been an innocent first time scene, not two kinky adults just doing it all over the place. Like, oh my god. What were you thinking? Now let's get to point number 5. This book has some weird prose. The writing style of this book is very flowery, and sometimes it's very beautiful, like the titular quote. These were the lovely bones that had grown around my absence, the connections, sometimes tenuous, sometimes made at great cost, but often magnificent, that happened after I was gone. While some metaphors were cringy, like her pupils dilated, pulsing in and out like small, ferocious olives. However, most of the lines and metaphors were kind of just there, not memorable and beautiful like the titular quote, but also not really cringy like that olive quote. However, they all were effective in giving Susie a distinct voice that fit her character, especially given this quote early on. In my junior high yearbook, I had a quote from a Spanish poet my sister had turned me on to, Juan Ramon Jimenez. It went like this: if they give you ruled paper, write the other way. I chose it both because it expressed my contempt for my structured surroundings a la the classroom, and because, not being some dopey quote from a rock band, I thought it marked me as literary. The writing style, it was unique. Even the bad could be justified as the writing of a 14-year-old trying too hard to be artsy. And also, since I was listening to it, I was probably less critical. However, if you're really against purple prose, you will probably not like this book. Now let's get to point number 6, feeling melancholy. One emotion this book did evoke into me while listening to it this time was a sense of melancholy, which is great sometimes. When I first started reading the book in high school, it made me extremely sad, like overwhelming, constant sadness. I was like, I can't read this, I'm putting it down. It was too depressing. However, this time while listening to it, it was more of a sense of melancholy and not a strong emotion. I do think Susie's immediate acceptance of everything did dull some of the emotions I could have felt. I don't know if this is because I listened to the book instead of reading it, but I didn't necessarily feel the anger, joy, sadness, and betrayal alongside the characters as much as a constant melancholy. Maybe it's the fact that it's from the perspective of a murdered girl and that's the topic of the book, or maybe it's the fact I listened to it in audiobook form, but I do wish I had felt a more variety of emotions more strongly. Now let's get to point number 7, the messy flashbacks. This book had a lot of flashbacks, and though usually they were fine, there were some of them that were really confusing and worth mentioning in this review. Mid-conversations, characters would have a flashback. Then within that flashback, they would have another flashback. And then by the time the story gets back to the initial conversation, I forgot what they were talking about. And it was just such a weird choice, and it was confusing. Luckily, this didn't happen too often and it's not book breaking, but when it did happen, it was such a strange choice because I've never seen anyone do that before. Like, why would you do this, Alice Bold? Finally, let's get to point number 8. The ending was dragged on. I have mixed feelings about the end of this book. In fact, the last couple of scenes at the end of the book had some really great lines that are really memorable, including the final line. However, the last couple scenes of the book kept leading me on to believe it was going to end, but then it would just keep going and going. And Susie even went to true heaven, and then it kept going still. And I'm like, what? Like, do you know how to end a book? It felt like the author kept thinking of scenes about the family's life that she wanted to show in the story and kept tacking it on after it should have ended and after I was already content with the story I had read. The end of the book lost some of its impact because of this. And despite the strong final line, this book's ending kind of reminds me of those songs that instead of having a good true ending, it just repeats the chorus quieter and quieter until it fades away and the song's just over. I hate that in songs, and now I can tell you I'd hate it in books. It's like, just give me a real ending. I don't even care if it ends with you repeating the chorus one time and just saying it slightly louder on the final word and then doing a with the guitar. Like, don't do the fade out thing. I cannot respect that. I mean, I can still like a song if it has the fade out thing and it doesn't ruin the book for me, but do a real ending. Anyway, that's all the points I have to make about The Lovely Bones. And overall, I did like this book and I couldn't stop listening to it. Again, I finished it in a little over 2 days. That's really quick because sometimes while listening to audiobooks, I get bored and just put them down. So yeah, I was definitely into this book while listening to it. And though this book is by no means perfect, the creativity of the writing, the heartfelt exploration of grief, and the amazing characters has resulted in a unique and memorable work of fiction that I am glad to have read, or I guess listened to. Anyway, those are all my thoughts. Do you want to read this? Have you read this? Did you like it? Or do you just have any opinions on the specific points I made or on that crazy spoiler scene? Please let me know all your thoughts down below. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed and I'll see you later.